November 1882. The snow came early to the Bitterroot Mountains that year, heavy and relentless, as if God himself had decided to seal the world away from human interference. Elias Mercer rounded the final bend in the trail, his boots crunching through 6 inches of fresh powder, and stopped cold. A woman stood in the doorway of his cabin, the only structure for 8 miles in any direction, the place he had chosen precisely because no one would ever find it unless they were looking. And this woman, whoever she was, had found it. She held his Winchester rifle, the one he kept loaded by the door. The barrel pointed square at his chest. Even from 30 yards, Elias could see 2 things clearly. She was heavily pregnant, her belly swelling beneath a wool coat that had seen better days. And she was not afraid to shoot. That's far enough. Her voice cut through the wind steady, despite the cold that turned her breath to white clouds. This cabin occupied or abandoned. Elias raised his gloved hands slowly. 15 years alone on this mountain. 15 years of silence and solitude, and the kind of peace that came from never having to explain himself to another living soul. And now, this. A pregnant woman with his gun asking questions she had no business asking. Occupied, he said carefully, measuring each word. By me, has been for 15 years. The woman's eyes narrowed. Even at this distance, he could see them calculating, assessing, deciding whether he was telling the truth or simply trying to reclaim stolen property. Her finger rested on the trigger, not tense, but ready. She knew how to hold a weapon. You don't look like you've been here recently. She gestured with the rifle barrel toward the cabin behind her. No smoke from the chimney, snow piled against the door, food stores untouched until I got here. Elias felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. She had been inside, had eaten his food, burned his wood, made herself at home in the one place on earth he had claimed as his own. The old anger rose in his chest, hot and familiar, but he forced it down. A pregnant woman alone in a Montana winter was not an intruder. She was desperate. I've been hunting, he said. 3 days up in the high country. Elk don't come down this far until December. He took a slow step forward. Now put down my rifle before someone gets hurt. Stay where you are. The command came sharp and immediate. She shifted her stance, bracing the weapon more firmly against her shoulder. I've been here 2 days. No tracks, no signs of life. I thought this place was abandoned. Well, it's not. Another careful step. And you're trespassing. I'm surviving. Her voice cracked slightly on the word, the first sign of weakness she had shown. There's a difference. Elias stopped. He had heard that tone before, years ago in field hospitals during the war. The sound of someone who had pushed beyond exhaustion into the territory where the body simply refused to stop because stopping meant dying. He looked at her more carefully now. The coat was good quality, or had been once. City clothes, not mountain gear. Her face was pale shadows dark beneath her eyes, and her hands, despite their steadiness on the rifle, trembled slightly. How long you been walking? He asked. She blinked, surprised by the question. How long you been walking to get here, in your condition? He nodded toward her belly. Can't have been easy. For a long moment she said nothing. The wind picked up, howling through the pines, and snow began to fall again in thick, heavy flakes. She swayed slightly, and Elias saw the exhaustion written in every line of her body. 2 days, she said finally, from Willow Creek. The last coach to Helena left without me. I had nowhere else to go. 8 miles from Willow Creek, through snow and cold, heavily pregnant alone. Elias felt something shift in his chest. Some long-dormant instinct that remembered what it meant to care about another person's survival. Lower the rifle, he said, his voice gentler now. I'm not going to hurt you, but you need to get inside before you freeze to death on my porch. How do I know I can trust you? But even as she asked, the rifle barrel dipped slightly, her arms weakening. You don't, Elias admitted, but I'm your best option right now. And that baby you're carrying doesn't care about trust. It just needs warmth. She looked down at her belly, one hand moving instinctively to rest there, protective and tender. When she looked back up, Something in her face had changed, not softened exactly, but shifted from defiance to a kind of resigned acceptance. "All right." She lowered the Winchester slowly, carefully, as if even that small surrender cost her something. "But I sleep with this. And if you try anything at all, I will shoot you." "Fair enough," Elias said. He approached the porch, watching her, the way he might watch a wild animal, cautious and respectful of her capacity for violence. Up close he could see she was younger than he had first thought. Mid-20s, perhaps, with dark hair pulled back in a braid that had come half undone, and gray eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. "Name's Elias Mercer," he said, stopping at the bottom step. "And you are—" She hesitated, and in that hesitation, Elias saw a whole story of secrets and careful decisions about what to reveal and what to keep hidden. "Grace," she said finally, "Grace Cunningham. I'm a widow." He nodded, not asking the obvious question about the lack of a wedding ring or mourning clothes. People in the mountains understood that sometimes silence was a kindness. "Well, Mrs. Cunningham, welcome to my home, such as it is." He climbed the steps and she moved aside to let him pass. "You said you ate my food stores," color rose in her pale cheeks. "I'm sorry. I thought no one was coming back. I left money on the table. What I could afford." Elias pushed open the door and saw the cabin transformed. Not dramatically, but in small ways that spoke of 2 days of habitation by someone who knew how to keep house. The floors had been swept, his scattered belongings organized, the fireplace cleaned of old ash, and on the rough-hewn table a small stack of coins, maybe $3, not nearly enough to cover what she had eaten, but probably every cent she had to her name. "Keep your money," he said, scooping up the coins and pressing them back into her hand. "You'll need it more than I will." "I don't take charity, Mr. Mercer." "It's not charity." He moved past her to stoke the fire, adding logs, until flames began to lick at the wood. "It's economics. You can stay until the baby comes. You cook clean, keep house. I provide shelter and food, no money involved, just work for room and board." She stared at him, and he could see her mind working through the offer, looking for the trap, the hidden cost, the inevitable betrayal. He recognized that wariness. He had worn it himself for 15 years. "Until the baby comes," she repeated slowly. "And then what? Then we revisit the arrangement." He hung his coat on the peg by the door, set his hunting pack down, and turned to face her. "I'm not a saint, Mrs. Cunningham. I don't do this out of goodness. I do it because I'm tired of cooking my own meals and living in a pigsty. If you can earn your keep, you can stay." "Fair, fair," she agreed, though her hand still clutched the rifle. "But I have one condition." "What's that?" "No questions about my past." Her gray eyes met his, steady and unflinching. "You don't ask about where I came from or why I'm here. And I don't ask about why a man lives alone in the middle of nowhere for 15 years. We keep our histories to ourselves." Elias felt the corners of his mouth twitch in what might have been a smile if he still remembered how to make one. "No questions about the past. I can live with that. Then we have an arrangement." She extended her free hand and he shook it. Her grip was firm, her palm calloused. Not the hand of a lady, but of someone who had worked hard in her life. "I'll take the main room," Elias said, releasing her hand. "You can have the lean-to off the back. It's small, but there's a cot and a stove. Should be warm enough." "Thank you." For the first time, something like relief flickered across her face. "And Mr. Mercer, I really am sorry about the food." "Forget it." He moved to check the supplies she had used mentally, cataloging what needed to be replaced. "You did what you had to do to survive. No shame in that." That night, after Grace had retired to the small lean-to room, Elias lay by the fire in his bedroll and listened to the sounds of another person breathing in his home. It had been so long, so desperately, achingly long since he had shared space with anyone. The loneliness had become so much a part of him that he had forgotten it was loneliness at all, had mistaken it for peace. But now, with Grace Cunningham sleeping 20 feet away, her presence filling the cabin with the weight of unspoken stories and carefully guarded secrets he remembered. Remembered what it felt like to be responsible for someone else's warmth, someone else's safety. And the memory terrified him. He closed his eyes and saw, as he always did in the moments before sleep, Abigail's face. Beautiful Abigail, who had loved him with a fierceness that should have been enough to keep her alive. Who had died thinking he despised her. Who had taken his child with her into the cold ground because he had been too proud, too wounded, too goddamn stubborn to believe in her innocence. The old guilt rose like bile in his throat. He forced it down, forced himself to breathe, forced himself to remember that the past was past, and nothing he did now could change it. But in the lean-to room, Grace Cunningham cried softly into her pillow, and the sound carried through the thin walls like an accusation. Morning came gray and cold, the sun hidden behind thick clouds that promised more snow. Elias woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, and for one disorienting moment he thought he was 20 years younger, married happy. Then reality reasserted itself, and he sat up to find Grace at his stove cooking breakfast with the efficiency of someone who had done this task 1,000 times before. "Morning," she said without turning around. "Coffee's ready. Eggs will be done in a minute." He poured himself a cup from the battered tin pot and took a sip. It was strong, bitter, perfect. Army coffee, the kind soldiers made in the field when staying awake, mattered more than taste. "You make coffee like a soldier," he observed. Her hand paused for just a fraction of a second before continuing to turn the eggs. "My father was in the cavalry, taught me young. Would died 10 years ago." She slid eggs onto 2 plates, added bacon, and brought them to the table. "Cholera outbreak at Fort Laramie. Took half the garrison." They ate in silence, the kind of companionable quiet that came from 2 people who understood the value of not filling every moment with meaningless words. Elias watched her covertly as she ate, noting the way she held her fork, the careful, measured bites that spoke of training in etiquette and manners. City bred, he decided. Officer's daughter. Which made her presence here alone and pregnant and running from something even more of a mystery. After breakfast, she insisted on washing the dishes while he prepared for the day's work. He noticed she organized his shelves as she worked, putting canned goods in neat rows, grouping like items together, creating order from the chaos he had lived in for years. And then she found it. His Bible. Buried at the back of a shelf under tools and spare ammunition and things he had not wanted to see or touch for more than a decade. She pulled it out, dust coating the worn leather cover, and placed it prominently on the small shelf by the window. Elias felt his chest tighten. "You don't need to do that." "A Bible shouldn't be hidden," Grace said quietly, running her fingers over the cover with something like reverence. "It should be where you can see it, where it can see you." "I don't read it anymore." "That's between you and God, Mr. Mercer, not my business." She moved away from the shelf, but the Bible remained a silent witness to his failures and his faith's collapse. Later that morning, Elias saddled his horse for the ride to Willow Creek. They needed supplies, more food, medical items for when the baby came news from the outside world. Grace had offered to go with him, but he had refused. 8 miles there and back on horseback was no journey for a woman in her condition, especially with more snow coming. "I'll be back before nightfall," he told her, swinging up into the saddle. "Keep the fire going. There's more wood stacked by the shed if you need it." "Be careful," Grace said, from the porch arms, wrapped around herself against the cold. "Trail gets slippery when it snows." The casual concern in her voice surprised him. They were strangers bound only by necessity and a business arrangement. Yet she spoke as if his safe return mattered to her, as if she might actually worry if he did not come back. "I've been riding these trails for 15 years, he said, gruffly uncomfortable with the sudden warmth in his chest. "I'll manage." The ride to Willow Creek took 3 hours through deepening snow. The town, such as it was, consisted of a general store, a church, a saloon, and a scattering of houses along the main road. Elias tied his horse outside Miller's general store and stepped inside, grateful for the warmth of the pot-bellied stove. Old Mr. Miller looked up from his ledger and grinned. "Elias Mercer, twice in 1 month. Must be the end times." "Need supplies?" Elias said, pulling out his list. "And I need them packed for travel." Miller's eyes scanned the list and his eyebrows rose. "Molasses cinnamon." "You learning to bake, Elias?" "Just fill the order, Henry. And these medical supplies. Bandages, clean cotton whiskey for sterilization." Miller looked up sharp-eyed despite his age. "You planning on delivering a baby up there?" Before Elias could answer, the door opened, bringing with it a gust of cold wind and Father Duncan McLeish. The priest stamped snow from his boots and nodded to both men, his ruddy Scottish face creased with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Elias," Duncan said, surprise evident in his voice. "Twice in as many weeks, and here I thought you'd taken a vow of hermitage." "Father," Elias acknowledged, turning back to Miller, "how long for the supplies?" 20 minutes. Miller headed to the back room, leaving Elias alone with the priest. Duncan moved to the stove, warming his hands. "Heard you've got company up at your place." Elias felt every muscle in his body tense. News travels fast. "Tom Bradley mentioned he guided a pregnant woman up the mountain road a few days back. Said she was headed toward your ridge. Figured it was either you or the wolves she was looking for." Duncan's eyes, pale blue and unnervingly perceptive, fixed on Elias's face. "Mail-order bride? No. Family? No." "Then what?" Elias exhaled slowly, fighting the urge to walk out of the store and leave Duncan's questions unanswered. But the priest was persistent, and more importantly, he was one of the few people in Willow Creek who had never judged Elias for his self-imposed exile. "A woman who needed shelter," Elias said finally. "That's all." "A pregnant woman," Duncan corrected gently. "Alone. In winter. That's not all, Elias. That's a story with chapters you're not telling." "It's not my story to tell." Duncan nodded slowly, accepting this. "Fair enough. But I'll ask you this, and I want the truth. Is she running from something or to something?" The question hung in the air between them. Elias thought of Grace's gray eyes, the way she had held his rifle with practiced ease, the prison-stamped envelope he had seen her burning in the fireplace just that morning before he left. He had not mentioned it to her. The arrangement was no questions, no past, but he had seen it. Deer Lodge Prison, Montana Territorial Penitentiary, official correspondence. "I don't know," Elias admitted, and it was the truth. "And I'm not sure it matters." "It will matter," Duncan said quietly. "It always matters, son. You can run from the past, but you can't outrun it. It catches up eventually, sometimes on horseback, sometimes in a letter, sometimes in the form of a pregnant woman on your doorstep." He paused, then added, "I'll pray for you both, for whatever's coming. Appreciate it, Father." Miller returned with the supplies packed and ready. Elias paid loaded everything into his saddlebags and prepared to leave. As he reached the door, Duncan called out, "Elias, one more thing." He turned. "If she needs sanctuary, the church is always open. And if she needs a midwife when her time comes, Mrs. Henderson in town has delivered half the babies in this valley. Just send word." "I will." The ride home took longer than expected. Fresh snow had covered the trail, making the path treacherous. By the time Elias crested the final ridge and saw his cabin below, smoke rising from the chimney, dusk had fallen. He should have felt relief at the sight. Instead, he felt a creeping sense of unease that he could not name. He dismounted, tied his horse, and carried the supplies toward the cabin. Through the window, he could see Grace moving around inside, tending the fire. Normal, domestic, safe. Then he saw the ashes in the yard. A small pile fresh, the snow around them melted from residual heat. Someone had burned something recently, and it had not been in the fireplace. Elias pushed open the door. Grace stood at the hearth, poking at the fire with unnecessary vigor. She did not turn around. "You're back," she said, her voice too bright, too casual. "I was starting to worry." "What did you burn?" The question came out harsher than he intended. Now she did turn, and he saw the wariness in her eyes. "Excuse me, in the yard. You burned something in the yard while I was gone. What was it?" Grace's hand moved to her apron pocket, a reflexive gesture she caught herself making, and stopped. "Just some old letters, personal things I didn't need anymore. Letters from where I thought we agreed, no questions about the past." "We did." Elias set the supplies down on the table, his movements deliberate and controlled. "But when a woman burns letters in the snow rather than the fireplace that's not past, that's present tense worry." For a long moment they stared at each other across the small cabin, the fire crackling between them. Then Grace reached into her pocket and pulled out a single envelope. The paper was charred at the edges, but the postmark was still visible. Deer Lodge Prison, Montana Territory. "You saw it this morning," she said. It was not a question. "I saw it. And you said nothing. Wasn't my business." Elias picked up the envelope, studying the official seal. "But if someone in prison is writing to you, and you're burning the letters in the snow, so I won't see them in the fireplace ash, then I need to know. Because whatever you're running from, it might come here, and this is my home." Grace's face had gone pale. "It's not what you think. I don't think anything. I don't know enough to think anything. But that's the problem, isn't it?" He set the envelope down carefully. "Who's in Deer Lodge, Grace?" She sank into a chair, one hand resting on her swollen belly. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My husband." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of implication in every direction. Elias felt the world tilt slightly. "I thought you said you were a widow." "I am, or I will be." She looked up, and he saw tears tracking down her cheeks. "James Cunningham, Lieutenant 3rd Cavalry. Court-martialed 6 months ago for theft of Army payroll. 15 years in Deer Lodge Prison. The shame killed him faster than the sentence. The prison chaplain wrote last month, consumption. He has maybe 2 months left." "So you're not a widow. You're a wife waiting to become one." "What's the difference?" The bitterness in her voice was corrosive. "He's as good as dead, and I'm as good as alone. The Army evicted me from officers' quarters the day after his sentencing. His family wants nothing to do with me. I have no money, no prospects, and a baby coming. Being a widow is cleaner, more sympathetic. People help widows. They just judge wives of thieves." Elias lowered himself into the other chair, processing this new information. Did he do it steal the payroll? Does it matter? It might. Grace wiped her eyes roughly with the back of her hand. "The Army says he did. They had evidence, money found in our quarters, signed receipts in his handwriting. He was convicted by court-martial in less than a day." She paused, then added quietly, "He told me he was innocent, right up until they led him away in chains. He said someone framed him. Do you believe him?" "I don't know." The honesty in those 3 words was devastating. "I wanted to. God, I wanted to, but the evidence was overwhelming, and I was pregnant and scared, and the whole world was falling apart. So I ran. I took what little money I had, and I ran. And now he's dying in a cell, and I don't even know if I should feel guilty or relieved." Elias sat back, the weight of her confession settling over them both. This was more than he had bargained for. A pregnant woman seeking shelter was one thing. A convicted thief's wife, fleeing from shame and suspicion, possibly herself implicated in the crime, that was another matter entirely. But as he looked at Grace, saw the exhaustion and fear and desperate honesty in her face, he made a decision. Perhaps not a wise one. Perhaps one he would regret, but the only one he could live with. "The arrangement stands," he said. "You work, I provide shelter. Your husband's crimes are his own, not yours, and definitely not mine. You're not worried that the Army might come looking. Let them come. I was a Union medic, saved more Army lives than I can count. They owe me more than I owe them." He stood, moving to unpack the supplies. "Besides, you're 8 months pregnant and stranded in a Montana winter. What do they think you're going to do? Steal another payroll? Despite everything." Grace laughed. It was a small sound, brief and fragile, but it was real. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer." "Elias," he corrected. "If we're going to share a cabin all winter, might as well use first names." "Grace," she said, standing and moving to help him unpack. "And Elias. About the letters, there's one more thing you should know." "What's that?" "The letter wasn't from James. It was from the prison warden, warning me that someone's been asking questions about my whereabouts, someone who's very interested in finding the wife of James Cunningham." The unease Elias had felt earlier crystallized into something sharper, more immediate. "Who?" The letter didn't say. "But whoever it is, they've been to Fort Benton, to Helena, asking at coaching stations and hotels, following my trail." She met his eyes. "I'm sorry I brought this to your door, but I had nowhere else to go." "You keep saying that, nowhere else. But Montana's a big territory. You could have gone anywhere. Why here? Why my cabin?" Grace hesitated, then reached into her other pocket and pulled out a small worn photograph. She handed it to him without a word. It was a military portrait. A young officer in Union blue, handsome and serious, standing beside a field hospital tent, and next to him, arm in a sling, his face younger but unmistakable, was Elias Mercer. "You knew me," Elias said slowly, staring at the photograph he had not seen in 20 years, "or knew of me." "My father served with you, Captain Robert Hendricks, 3rd Cavalry Medical Corps. He died at Fort Laramie, but he talked about you in his letters home. Said you were the best field medic in the war. Said you could bring a man back from the edge of death through sheer stubbornness." She took the photograph back gently. "When I had nowhere else to go, I remembered his letters, remembered he said you'd retired to the Bitterroot Mountains. I didn't know if I'd find you, didn't know if you'd help if I did, but it was the only thread I had left to pull." Robert Hendricks. The name hit Elias like a blow to the chest. He remembered the captain, young, idealistic, brilliant physician who had taught Elias more about field medicine than any textbook, who had died not of cholera but of exhaustion, working 18-hour shifts to save his men during the outbreak, who had a daughter, little girl Elias had met once, dark-haired and serious, maybe 8 or 9 years old. That little girl was standing in his cabin now 20 years older, pregnant and desperate, seeking refuge from a past she could not escape. "Jesus," Elias breathed. "I should have told you from the start," Grace said. "But I thought if you knew you might feel obligated. And I didn't want your help out of debt to my father. I wanted it because you chose to give it." "Grace?" He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw Robert Hendricks in the set of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes. "Your father saved my life, twice. Once from a Minié ball that would have killed me if he hadn't gotten it out in time. Once from the bottle when I was drinking myself to death after the war." He paused. "So, yes, I feel obligated. But that's not why I'm helping you. I'm helping you because you need it. And because I've spent 15 years alone on this mountain trying to outrun debts I can never repay. Maybe this is one I actually can." They stood in the warm cabin snow falling outside, the fire crackling between them. Two people carrying burdens of guilt and shame, and complicated histories, finding themselves unlikely allies in a winter that promised to test them both. That night, long after Grace had gone to bed, Elias sat by the fire and thought about the photograph, about Robert Hendricks, about the strange paths that led people to each other in moments of desperate need. He thought about the person who was looking for Grace, following her trail across Montana. He thought about the husband dying in Deer Lodge prison and the question of innocence or guilt that remained unanswered. But mostly he thought about Grace herself. The way she had stood on his porch with his rifle unafraid, the way she had organized his chaos with gentle efficiency, the way she had told him the truth eventually when she could have continued lying. And he wondered if the past could ever really be left behind or if it always found you. In the end, no matter how far you ran, no matter how deep you tried to bury it in the mountain snow. Outside in the darkness, beyond the firelight, fresh tracks circled the cabin. Horse prints barely visible in the falling snow. Someone had been there, watching, waiting. But Elias, lost in his thoughts and memories, did not see them, not yet. Not until morning, when it would already be too late to know how long they had been observed, or by whom, or what that silent watcher's intentions might be. The fire burned low. The snow continued to fall. And in the small lean-to room, Grace Cunningham lay awake, one hand on her belly, listening to the wind, and wondering if she had finally found sanctuary or simply led her demons to a different kind of door. The storm arrived 3 weeks after Grace had settled into the rhythm of cabin life. It came not with gentle snowfall, but with the kind of violence that reminded men how small they were against the indifference of nature. Wind screamed through the pines like something alive and hungry. Snow fell so thick that Elias could not see the barn from the cabin door. He had spent the morning reinforcing the shutters, bringing in extra firewood, making sure the animals had enough feed to last several days if the storm trapped them inside. Grace worked beside him as much as her condition allowed her belly, now so large that simple tasks left her breathless and pale. "You should rest," Elias told her as she struggled to lift a water bucket. "I can handle this." "I'm pregnant, not dying," she replied, but she let him take the bucket anyway. "How long do you think the storm will last?" 2 days, maybe 3. He set the bucket by the fire to keep the water from freezing. "We've got enough supplies, we'll be fine." But even as he said it, he felt that familiar unease creeping up his spine. The tracks he had found circling the cabin 3 mornings running. The sense of being watched that had plagued him for days now. He had said nothing to Grace, not wanting to worry her, but he kept his rifle loaded and close, and he slept lighter than he had in years. The knock came just after noon, barely audible over the howl of wind. 3 solid raps on the door, deliberate and patient. Elias grabbed his Winchester, motioned for Grace to move away from the door, and called out, "Who's there?" "Sergeant Warren Hastings, Deer Lodge Prison." The voice that came through the door was rough, exhausted, but steady. "I'm looking for Grace Cunningham." Grace's face went white. She gripped the edge of the table, her breathing suddenly shallow and rapid. Elias moved to the door but did not open it. "What's your business with Mrs. Cunningham?" "I have a message from her husband. I've ridden 3 days to deliver it. Please, sir, I'm half frozen, and my horse is about done. I mean no harm." Elias looked at Grace. She nodded, though fear still haunted her eyes. He opened the door. The man who stumbled inside was perhaps 50, weathered and solid, wearing the dark blue uniform of a territorial prison guard beneath a snow-crusted coat. His face was lined with cold and something deeper, a weariness that spoke of years spent witnessing human suffering. He pulled off his hat, ice crackling in his graying beard, and his eyes found Grace immediately. "Mrs. Cunningham," he said, and there was genuine respect in his voice. "I apologize for the intrusion. I know this must be frightening. How did you find me?" Grace's voice was barely above a whisper. "Your father's letters to your husband. Lieutenant Cunningham kept them all. Mentioned Captain Hendricks had talked about a field medic named Elias Mercer who retired to the Bitterroot Mountains." Hastings looked at Elias. "Took me 2 weeks to track down which mountain. People in Willow Creek said you'd taken in a pregnant woman. I took a chance it was her." "What do you want?" Elias kept the rifle pointed down but ready. "To deliver a message and to make an offer." Hastings reached slowly into his coat, pulled out an envelope sealed with official prison wax. "Your husband is dying, Mrs. Cunningham. Consumption. The prison doctor gives him 2 months at most. He's asked to see you. One last time." Grace swayed, and Elias moved quickly to guide her to a chair. She sat heavily, both hands pressed to her belly as if to shield the baby from this news. 2 months, she repeated numbly. "He's really dying." "Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry." Hastings stood awkwardly, snow melting into puddles at his feet. "But there's more. Something you need to know. Something that changes everything." "What could possibly change anything now?" Grace looked up, and Elias saw the old bitterness flooding back into her face. "He's dying in prison for a crime that destroyed both our lives. What's left to change?" Hastings glanced at Elias as if asking permission to continue. Elias nodded. Whatever this was, Grace had a right to hear it. "Lieutenant Cunningham confessed," Hastings said quietly, "to the warden, to the prison chaplain, to me, about the real thief." The cabin went silent except for the wind battering the walls. Grace stared at Hastings as if he had spoken in a foreign language. "What are you talking about?" she finally managed. "Your husband didn't steal that payroll, Mrs. Cunningham. His commanding officer did, Captain Bernard Ashford. The lieutenant took the fall to protect you." The words hung in the air like smoke. Elias watched Grace's face cycle through disbelief, confusion, and finally a dawning horror that made his chest ache. "No," Grace whispered. "No, that's not possible. The evidence, the money in our quarters, the signed receipts. All planted, all forged." Hastings pulled out a second envelope, this one worn and creased as if it had been read many times. "Captain Ashford stole the payroll to cover gambling debts. When the theft was discovered, he needed someone to blame. He chose the lieutenant. Planted evidence. Forged the receipts using copies of the lieutenant's signature from requisition forms." "But James confessed," Grace said desperately, as if clinging to this one fact could make the rest untrue. "He pleaded guilty at the court-martial." "Because Ashford threatened you." Hastings's voice was gentle but relentless. "Told the lieutenant that if he fought the charges, Ashford would implicate you as an accomplice. Said you'd signed some of the payroll receipts, which was true. You hadn't you routine paperwork that Ashford asked you to help with." Grace's hand flew to her mouth. Oh God, the receipts. "He said they needed to be filed before the audit. He said it was just administrative work. I never questioned it. I never thought—" "You had no way of knowing," Hastings said. "Ashford used you to create evidence of your involvement. Then he told the lieutenant, plead guilty and go quietly, or watch your pregnant wife stand trial as your accomplice. The lieutenant chose prison to save you." The dam broke. Grace bent forward, sobs tearing from her chest with such force that Elias thought she might shatter. He knelt beside her chair, one hand on her shoulder, feeling utterly helpless in the face of her grief. "He let them take him," she gasped between sobs. "He let them put him in that hell. For me. And I ran. I abandoned him. I thought he was guilty and I ran." "You didn't know," Elias said quietly. "Grace, you couldn't have known. I should have believed him. He told me he was innocent. He looked me in the eyes and told me, and I was too afraid, too proud, too goddamn cowardly to believe him." She looked up at Hastings, tears streaming down her face. "Does he know that I ran, that I gave up on him? He knows you left. But he doesn't blame you, ma'am. He blames himself for not telling you the truth, for not trusting you with the real reason he took the fall. His last words to me before I left were that you deserved better than a husband who died in chains." "I have to see him." Grace stood abruptly, swaying with the sudden movement. "I have to tell him I'm sorry. I have to tell him about the baby. He doesn't know, does he? About the baby?" "No, ma'am. You left before you knew yourself. Then I have to go. Now. Today." She turned to Elias, desperation bright in her eyes. "How far is Deer Lodge?" 150 miles, Elias said carefully. 4 days' ride minimum in good weather. In this storm with you in your condition, it's suicide." "I don't care. He's dying because of me." "He's dying because he chose to save you," Elias corrected. "Don't dishonor that by killing yourself and his child trying to reach him." "I brought a wagon," Hastings offered quietly, "enclosed with a stove. I can drive Mrs. Cunningham. We'll go slow stop when we need to. There's a midwife at the prison. If the baby comes early, we'll manage." "The baby's due any day," Elias said sharply. "You won't make it 50 miles before she goes into labor, and when she does in the middle of nowhere, in a blizzard, what then? Then we'll deal with it." Grace's voice had taken on a steel edge he had not heard before. "Elias, I left my husband when he needed me most. I let him rot in prison thinking I believed him guilty. I will not let him die alone thinking I never loved him enough to fight for him. You'll die trying to reach him, and the baby with you. Maybe, but at least I'll die trying to do the right thing, instead of running, like I always run." The words struck Elias like a physical blow. And he saw in Grace's face an echo of his own guilt, his own failures, his own history of choosing the coward's path. He thought of Abigail dying while he stood silent and cold, withholding the forgiveness she had begged for. He thought of the 15 years he had spent in this cabin hiding from the consequences of his own pride. "All right," he heard himself say. "But I'm coming with you, both of you." Grace blinked. "Elias, you don't have to do that." "Yes, I do." He moved to the window, looking out at the storm. "There's a way station at Hellgate Canyon, 50 miles. If we make it there, we can reassess. If the weather clears, we push on. If it doesn't, we wait it out where there's shelter and help. And if the baby comes before we reach Hellgate, then I'll deliver it. I've done it before." The lie came easily, smoothly, because the truth was too complicated to explain. He had assisted at births during the war, yes, but the one birth that mattered, the only one that had been his own child, had ended in death and silence and accusations he had been too stubborn to refute. Hastings looked between them, reading the currents of unspoken history flowing beneath the surface of their conversation. "If we're going, we should leave at first light. This storm will blow itself out by dawn. We'll have maybe 24 hours of clear weather before the next system moves in." "Then we leave at first light," Elias agreed. He turned to Grace. "But tonight you tell me everything. No more secrets. If we're riding into this, I need to know exactly what we're facing." Grace nodded. "Everything, I promise." That night, after Hastings had bedded down in the barn with the horses, Elias and Grace sat by the fire. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin an uneasy peace had settled. Grace wrapped in a blanket Elias, whittling a piece of wood with hands that needed the distraction. "I signed the receipts in August." Grace began, her voice quiet but steady. "Captain Ashford came to our quarters one evening when James was on patrol, said he needed help with administrative work, that his clerk was sick. It seemed routine. I'd helped with paperwork before. Army wives often did. How many receipts? Maybe a dozen. Payroll authorizations, transfer documents. I didn't read them carefully. I should have, but I didn't." She pulled the blanket tighter. 2 weeks later, the payroll went missing. $5,000. The investigation started immediately, and then they found money in our quarters, hidden in a trunk James used for his spare uniforms. $500 in Army scrip. Planted? Obviously. But I didn't know that then. James came home in chains. They wouldn't let me see him before the court-martial. When I finally got into the hearing room, he just looked at me and said, "I'm sorry, Grace, I'm so sorry." And I thought he was confessing, admitting what he'd done. But he was apologizing for what he was about to do, taking the fall. Yes. Grace's voice broke slightly. The court-martial lasted 3 hours. James pleaded guilty, didn't fight the charges, didn't present a defense, just sat there while they sentenced him to 15 years hard labor. And I sat in that courtroom, watching my life end, thinking my husband had betrayed everything we were. "When did you find out you were pregnant?" "A week after he was sent to Deer Lodge. The prison chaplain had delivered a letter from James. Just one line, 'Forgive me.' I was so angry, so hurt. And then I realized I'd missed my monthly time. Twice." She touched her belly gently. "I went to the post-surgeon. He confirmed it. 8 weeks along. Conceived before the theft, before the arrest, before everything fell apart." "Well, did you write to James, tell him?" "I started to. 10 times I started letters. But what could I say? You destroyed our lives, but by the way, you're going to be a father." "How do you write that letter?" She wiped her eyes. "So I ran instead. Took what little money I had saved from my housekeeping allowance, left Fort Benton in the middle of the night. Told no one where I was going." "Because you were afraid. Terrified. The Army evicted me within days. James's family sent a letter disowning us both. And people talked. Oh God, how they talked about the thief's wife, about whether I had known, whether I had helped, whether the baby was even his." Her voice turned bitter. "A woman alone pregnant associated with theft and scandal. I was poisoned. No one would hire me. No one would help me." Elias set down his whittling, his chest tight with an anger that had nowhere to go. "So you remembered your father's letters?" About the field medic in the mountains. It was all I had left. A name and a place and a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, you'd be the kind of man my father believed you were. She looked at him directly. And you are. You let me stay. You didn't ask questions. You gave me shelter when the whole world had turned me out. I had my own reasons, Elias said quietly. Guilt makes strange bedfellows. Then tell me. Grace leaned forward. You said I had to tell you everything. Fair is fair, Elias. What guilt drives you to hide in these mountains? For a long moment, he considered refusing. The arrangement had been no questions about the past, but they had moved beyond arrangements now into something more complicated and more honest. Her name was Abigail, he began, and once he started the words came like water through a broken dam. Abigail Hendricks, your father's sister. Grace's eyes widened. My aunt? You married my father's sister. After the war. She'd been working at the field hospital helping her brother. We fell in love. Or I thought we did. Maybe it was just exhaustion and proximity and the need for something beautiful in the middle of all that death. He stared into the fire. She got pregnant before we married. It was a scandal. Her family was furious. We married quickly, quietly. I shipped back out within a month. And when you came home, the rumors had started that the baby wasn't mine, that Abigail had been with other men while I was gone, that she'd trapped me into marriage with another man's child. The old poison rose in his throat. I believed them. God help me, I believed them. When I looked at her, all I saw was betrayal. When she tried to explain, to defend herself, I turned away. Grace made a small sound of pain, but Elias continued, needing to finish the story now that he had started it. The baby came early, stillborn, a boy. Perfect in every way, except he didn't breathe. Abigail held him and cried, and begged me to look at him, to see him, to mourn him with her. His voice cracked. I refused. I told her God had judged us both, that the baby's death was punishment for her sin. Oh, Elias. 3 days later she died, childbed fever. She called for me at the end. The doctor said she wanted to tell me something, wanted my forgiveness. I wouldn't go to her. I let her die alone, thinking I hated her. He finally looked at Grace, not bothering to hide the tears on his face. 10 years later, I found her diary, hidden in a trunk I'd never opened. She'd written everything, about the rumors about who had started them, a man who'd wanted to marry her, who spread lies when she chose me instead, about the baby, about how she knew he was mine because she'd never been with anyone else, about how she loved me even as I broke her heart. The baby was yours. Yes. And I killed them both. Not with my hands, but with my pride, my suspicion, my inability to believe that someone like her could actually love someone like me. He wiped his face roughly. I came to these mountains because I couldn't live in a world where I'd have to see my reflection and remember what I'd done. I've been here 15 years, and it's not nearly long enough to forget. Grace reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. Her grip was strong, warm, alive. Listen to me, Elias Mercer. You made a terrible mistake. You listened to lies and let pride destroy your chance at happiness. But you're not alone in that. I did the same thing. I heard accusations about James and I ran instead of fighting for him. We're both cowards who failed the people we loved. That doesn't absolve us. No, but maybe it means we get a chance to do better this time. She squeezed his hand. You're helping me reach James. You're giving me the chance to say what I should have said 6 months ago. That's not cowardice. That's courage. Late courage maybe, but courage nonetheless. They sat in silence, hands clasped, the fire burning low between them. Outside, the storm began to ease, the wind's howl dropping to a mournful whisper. And in that quiet space, Elias felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in 15 years. Hope, not for himself. He was beyond redemption, beyond second chances. But for Grace, for the baby she carried, for the possibility that sometimes, if you were willing to risk everything, you could make one thing right before it was too late. We should sleep, he said finally. Dawn comes early, and it's a hard ride to Hellgate. Grace nodded, released his hand, and stood. At the door to her room, she paused. "Elias, thank you for telling me, for trusting me with your story. We're even now. No more secrets." "No more secrets," she agreed. But they were both wrong. There were secrets, still things not yet revealed, truths, waiting in the snow and the silence. And by the time those final secrets came to light, the world would look very different than it did in that moment of fragile honesty beside the dying fire. Dawn broke clear and cold, the storm's fury spent, leaving behind a world transformed by fresh snow. Elias loaded the wagon while Hastings hitched the horses, moving with the efficient silence of men who understood that time mattered and words did not. Grace emerged from the cabin bundled in every warm thing she owned, moving slowly, one hand pressed to her lower back. Elias saw the grimace she tried to hide and felt his gut tighten with worry. "How are you feeling? Like I'm about to ride 150 miles while 9 months pregnant." She managed a wan smile. "But I felt worse." They helped her into the back of the wagon where Hastings had rigged a makeshift bed with blankets and straw. A small stove provided heat, its chimney pipe extending through a hole in the canvas top. Cramped cold, but better than riding horseback in her condition. Elias swung up onto his horse rifle across his saddle. "I'll ride ahead, scout the trail. Hastings, you keep her warm and stop if she needs it. We're in no rush." "We're in every rush," Grace called from the wagon. "James is dying." "James has been dying for months," Elias replied more harshly than he intended. "A few extra hours won't matter, but if you go into labor in the middle of nowhere, that will matter. So we do this careful, and we do it right." Grace didn't argue, which worried him more than anything else could have. They moved slowly down the mountain, the wagon creaking and swaying over the rutted trail. Elias rode point, watching for ice patches and fallen branches, anything that might overturn the wagon or break an axle. Behind him, he could hear Hastings talking to Grace in low, steady tones. "Your husband's a good man, Mrs. Cunningham. Best man in that prison, if you ask me. When I told him I was illiterate, that I'd never learned my letters growing up, you know what he did? He taught me. Every evening after lockdown, he'd work with me through the cell bars. First book I ever read was the Bible, because of your husband. He always believed education was freedom." Grace's voice came muffled by the canvas, but audible. "Even when we had nothing, he'd spend what little money we had on books. He told the other prisoners the same thing, started a school of sorts. Some of the guards didn't like it, thought it would cause trouble, but I convinced the warden to allow it. Lieutenant Cunningham changed that place, made it a little more human, a little less hell." Elias listened to this exchange and felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. James Cunningham had sacrificed his freedom to save his wife, then used his imprisonment to bring light into darkness. While Elias had spent 15 years hiding from his own failures, another man had faced his and turned them into something meaningful. The morning wore on. The sun climbed higher, but brought little warmth. They passed through stands of pine and aspen, across frozen streams, through valleys where the snow lay pristine and unmarked, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Around midday, Elias called a halt near a sheltered clearing. They needed to rest the horses, and Grace needed to move a stretch, relieve herself in whatever privacy the wilderness could offer. He helped her down from the wagon and watched as she walked a few steps, then stopped, her face going pale. "Grace, I'm fine, just the baby's very active today." "Active or something else?" She met his eyes, and he saw the fear she was trying to hide. "I don't know. Different. Pressure. Like something's shifting." Elias's medical instinct kicked in. How different? Pain different, or position different? Position. "I think, maybe. I've never done this before, Elias. I don't know what's normal and what isn't." Hastings approached, concern evident on his weathered face. "How much farther to Hellgate?" 20 miles, maybe 4 hours at the pace we're going." Elias calculated rapidly. If Grace was starting labor, they had time. If it was false labor, the pressure would ease. If it was something worse, something wrong with the baby's position, or Grace's health, they needed to reach the way station and Miriam Walker's midwife experience as fast as possible. We keep moving, he decided, but we push the pace. Hastings, drive as fast as you can without risking the wagon. I'll ride ahead to Hellgate, let them know we're coming. I'm fine, Grace protested. We don't need to rush. We're rushing anyway, Elias said firmly. He mounted his horse and spurred it forward, leaving the wagon to follow at its own speed. The ride to Hellgate took 2 hours of hard pushing. By the time Elias saw the way station emerging from the trees, his horse was lathered and blowing. He dismounted in the yard and hammered on the door. Ezra Walker opened it, surprise crossing his dark, seamed face. Elias Mercer, didn't expect to see you down off that mountain till spring. I need Miriam. There's a pregnant woman coming, maybe in labor, maybe not. We're headed to Deer Lodge, but she might not make it that far. Ezra's expression shifted instantly from surprise to competence. Miriam, he called into the house. Got a birthing coming. To Elias he said, bring her in when she gets here. We'll set up the back room. Miriam Walker appeared, wiping her hands on an apron, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. She was perhaps 65, small and wiry, with a kind of face that had seen everything and been surprised by nothing. How far along? She asked Elias. 9 months, maybe a week or two early. She's been having pressure movement, but no contractions yet that she's mentioned. First baby? Yes. Then it could be days yet. First ones take their time. But Miriam was already moving, pulling out clean linens, setting water to boil, preparing with the efficiency of a woman who had delivered more babies than she could count. What's she doing traveling this close to her time, going to see her dying husband in Deer Lodge prison? Miriam's hands stilled for just a moment, then resumed their work. That's a hard journey for a woman in her condition, hard in more ways than one. The wagon arrived 20 minutes later. Grace was pale but composed as Elias and Hastings helped her inside. Miriam took one look at her and nodded. Let's get you lying down, child. I need to examine you. I'm fine, really. We just need to rest the horses and then keep going. You're not going anywhere until I've checked that baby. Miriam's tone brooked no argument. She led Grace to the back room and closed the door. Elias paced the main room while Ezra made coffee, and Hastings saw to the horses. The minutes stretched like hours. Finally, Miriam emerged, her expression neutral. Baby's dropped. She's in early labor whether she knows it or not. Could be hours, could be days, but that baby's coming soon. Can she travel? Hastings asked. She can do whatever she sets her mind to, Miriam said dryly. Question is whether she should. Deer Lodge is 100 miles from here. If she goes into active labor on the road, you'll be delivering that baby in a wagon, or worse, in the snow. Is seeing her husband worth risking both their lives? He's dying. Grace's voice came from the doorway. She stood there, one hand on the frame for support. And he's innocent. He took the blame for a crime he didn't commit to save me. I will see him before he dies. I will tell him I believe him, that I love him, that he's going to be a father. Even if it kills me. Might kill the baby too, Miriam said bluntly. Then I'll die knowing I tried to do the right thing instead of the safe thing. Grace's eyes were fierce. I've been safe my whole life. Safe and scared, and it's gotten me nothing but regrets. No more. Ezra spoke up quietly. There's another way. Faster, but more dangerous. The old mining road through Copper Ridge cuts 40 miles off the journey to Deer Lodge. Rough as hell, but in winter, with snow covering the worst ruts, might be passable. How rough? Elias asked. Steep grades, narrow passes. One bad stretch where a wagon could slide right off the mountainside if you're not careful, but it'd get you there in 2 days instead of 4. We take it, Grace said immediately. Grace, if something happens on that road, there's no help, no shelter, nothing but wilderness and cold. Then you'll deliver the baby, Elias. You said you'd done it before. He had said that. A lie that was about to be tested if Grace went into labor in the middle of a mountain pass. But looking at her face, at the determination burning there, he knew arguing was pointless. We take the mining road, he agreed. But we wait out the night here. Let you rest. Let the horses rest. We leave at first light. Grace nodded, accepting this compromise. That night, while Grace slept in the back room under Miriam's watchful eye, Ezra pulled Elias aside. "There's something you should know. Man came through yesterday, asking about a pregnant woman headed this way, said he was looking for the wife of a prisoner from Deer Lodge." Elias felt ice form in his veins. What kind of man? Military bearing. Officer, I'd say, though he wasn't in uniform. Nervous. Kept looking over his shoulder like he expected someone to follow him. Had the look of a man running from something. "Did you tell him anything?" "Told him I'd seen no one. But Elias, he was heading toward Deer Lodge. Same direction you're going. And he had that look. You know the one I mean. Desperate men do desperate things." "You think he's dangerous?" "I think he's scared. And scared men are more dangerous than angry ones." Ezra met his eyes. "You're walking into something complicated. That woman's husband confessed, you said, implicated someone else, someone with everything to lose." "Captain Bernard Ashford," Hastings said, emerging from the shadows. "The real thief. I didn't want to worry Mrs. Cunningham, but the warden mentioned Ashford's been making inquiries about the lieutenant's confession about his wife's whereabouts. Man's terrified the truth will come out." "He's coming for Grace," Elias said slowly, the pieces falling into place. "To silence her. To make sure she can't corroborate her husband's story. Or to use her as leverage. Make her testify that the lieutenant was delusional, that his confession was the ramblings of a dying man." Hastings' face was grim. "The lieutenant told me if anything happened to get his wife to the U.S. Marshal in Helena. Show them the documentation he prepared. But Helena's farther than Deer Lodge, and Mrs. Cunningham won't go anywhere except to her husband. Then we get her to Deer Lodge, fast, before Ashford finds her." They left at dawn, taking the mining road as planned. The track was exactly as bad as Ezra had warned, worse, in some ways, better in others, where snow had smoothed the roughest patches. The wagon lurched and groaned as Hastings navigated switchbacks that seemed designed to test a man's faith in gravity. Elias rode ahead and behind alternately, watching for signs of pursuit for Ashford or anyone else who might be following, but the trail remained empty, save for their own tracks. Grace bore the rough journey with stoic determination, but Elias could see the toll it took. By afternoon she was pale and sweating, despite the cold one hand pressed constantly to her belly. "How are you doing?" he asked during one of their brief rest stops. "The contractions started an hour ago, 10 minutes apart, maybe 12. Not bad yet, but they're coming. We should stop, find shelter." "There's an old mine shaft about 2 miles ahead," Hastings said, checking his map. "Used to work these mountains. Abandoned for 20 years, but the main shaft should still be sound. Could shelter there if we need to." "We need to," Elias decided, seeing the way Grace was breathing now, short and shallow fighting pain she would not admit to. They reached the mine as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow. The entrance was partially collapsed, but passable, opening into a chamber perhaps 20 feet deep and 10 wide. Dry, protected from wind, with enough room for a fire without risking smoke inhalation. "This'll do," Ezra said, and began unhitching the horses. They had barely gotten Grace inside, settled on blankets near a hastily built fire, when her water broke. The gush of fluid soaked through her skirts, and her face went white with shock and fear. "No," she whispered. "No, not yet. We're still 60 miles from Deer Lodge. I haven't seen James yet. I haven't told him." "The baby doesn't care about miles or timing," Elias said, kneeling beside her with a calm he did not feel. "It's coming, now, tonight, and we're going to help you bring it into the world." "I'm scared," Grace admitted, and the raw honesty in her voice nearly broke him. "I know. I'm scared too. But I'm here. Hastings is here, and we're not going to let anything happen to you or this baby. I promise." The labor that followed was the longest night of Elias's life. Grace labored for 4 hours, then 6, then 8, the contractions coming harder and faster, until she was crying out with each one, her voice echoing in the stone chamber. Hastings stayed at her head, holding her hands, talking to her in low, steady tones, reciting prayers and Bible verses that Grace clung to like lifelines. Elias worked between her legs, checking dilation, monitoring the baby's progress, drawing on half-remembered medical training and pure instinct. He thought of Abigail dying in a different room, in a different time, while he stood silent and cold. He thought of the baby that had not breathed the son he had never mourned properly. He would not fail again. Not this time. Not this child. Not this woman who had trusted him with her life and her husband's memory. "Push Grace," he commanded, as the baby's head crowned, "hard as you can." She bore down with a sound that was more battle cry than scream, and the baby's head emerged, then shoulders, and then with a rush that left Elias's hands full of slippery, wriggling life, the entire infant slid into the world, a girl, perfect, beautiful, and utterly, terrifyingly silent. "Why isn't she crying?" Grace gasped. "Elias, why isn't she crying?" He did not answer, too focused on clearing the baby's mouth and nose, on rubbing her chest, on doing everything he remembered from field medicine and desperate prayers. The baby remained limp blue, not breathing. "No," he heard himself saying. "No, not again. Not this time. Breathe, damn you. Breathe." He turned the infant face down, supporting her tiny chest with one hand, and struck her back firmly between the shoulder blades. Once, twice, a third time harder. And then, like a miracle, a cough, a sputter, and finally the most beautiful sound Elias had ever heard in his life. A baby's cry, loud, angry, gloriously alive. "She's breathing," he said, his voice breaking. "Grace, she's breathing. You have a daughter." He wrapped the baby in clean cloth and placed her on Grace's chest. Grace, exhausted and crying and more beautiful than any person had a right to be after 8 hours of labor, cradled her daughter and wept. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Hello, Hope. I'm your mama, and your daddy is waiting to meet you." They rested there in the mine shaft, the fire crackling, the baby nursing Grace drifting in and out of exhausted sleep. Hastings had gone outside to check the horses to give the new mother privacy. Elias sat against the wall watching Grace and the baby, feeling something vast and overwhelming threatening to drown him. He had delivered a child, had brought life into the world instead of death, had kept his promise. The sound of hoofbeats brought him to his feet, rifle in hand. Too many horses. Not just Hastings returning, someone else. Multiple someones. He moved to the mine entrance and saw them. 3 riders coming up the trail in the last light of dusk. Hastings stood in the snow, hands raised, facing a man on horseback who held a pistol aimed at his chest. "Where is she?" the man demanded. "Where's Grace Cunningham?" Captain Bernard Ashford had found them. But before Elias could move, before he could raise his rifle or call out a warning, a 4th rider appeared behind the others, older, smaller, wearing the dark coat and white collar of a priest. Father Duncan McLeish, mounted on a sturdy mountain horse, carrying in his saddlebags something that would change everything. "Lower your weapon, Captain," Duncan said calmly. "These people are under the protection of God and the territorial law, and I have a message that makes your presence here both irrelevant and criminal." Ashford turned his horse pistol, now swinging, toward Duncan. "Who the hell are you?" "Father Duncan McLeish from Willow Creek Parish, and I've just come from Deer Lodge Prison. I'm afraid I have news. Lieutenant James Cunningham died this morning. But before he passed, he left something for his wife. Something that's going to make your life very difficult, Captain Ashford." Inside the mine, Grace heard the name and let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a wail. "No, no, he can't be. I was so close. I was almost there." Elias stood frozen between the mine and the confrontation outside, trapped between a woman who had just lost everything and a man who had come to destroy what little remained. And in his arms, baby Hope began to cry, as if she understood that the world she had been born into was more complicated and more broken than any infant should have to face. The night was far from over, and the truth, when it finally came to light, would test them all in ways none of them had imagined. Father Duncan McLeish remained mounted, his hand steady on the reins despite the pistol aimed at his chest. In the dying light, his face held the kind of calm that came from years of facing human darkness and finding it less frightening than the judgment of God. "I said lower your weapon, Captain Ashford." Duncan repeated his Scottish burr more pronounced than usual. "Or would you prefer to add assaulting a man of the cloth to your growing list of crimes?" Ashford's hand trembled, but the pistol did not waver. "That woman is a material witness. I have every right to question her about her husband's delusions." Delusions! Duncan reached slowly into his saddlebag, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "Is that what you're calling a dying man's confession now?" The warden at Deer Lodge had a different name for it. He called it the truth. The ravings of a consumptive prisoner mean nothing without corroboration. "Then perhaps you should hear what Lieutenant Cunningham left behind before making that judgment." Duncan pulled out a thick envelope sealed with both wax and the official stamp of Deer Lodge Prison. "This is addressed to Grace Cunningham, and by territorial law, I am obligated to deliver it to her. If you interfere, you're obstructing a legal document delivery. That's a federal offense, Captain." Elias used the distraction to step out of the mine entrance rifle, raised and aimed. "He's not alone anymore, Ashford. You've got 3 guns on you now, 4 if Mrs. Cunningham can reach hers, and I promise you we're all better shots than you are." Ashford's eyes darted between Elias, Duncan, and Hastings, calculating odds he did not like. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his pistol. "Smart choice," Elias said. "Now dismount. Slow. Keep your hands where I can see them." Ashford climbed down from his horse, and Hastings moved quickly to take his weapon. The captain's 2 companions, hired guns by the look of them, were disarmed as well, and herded together near the mine entrance. "Elias?" Grace's voice came from inside the mine, weak and frightened. "What's happening?" "Everything's fine," he called back, though his eyes never left Ashford. "Father Duncan's here. He has a letter from James." The silence that followed was profound. Then, quietly, Grace said, "Bring it to me, please." Duncan dismounted and handed his reins to one of Ashford's now disarmed men. He carried the envelope into the mine as if it were a sacred relic, and perhaps it was. The last words of a dying man to the wife he had saved and lost. Inside, Grace sat propped against the stone wall, baby Hope sleeping in her arms. Her face was tear-stained and exhausted, but when she saw the envelope, something shifted in her expression. Not quite hope, but not despair either. A kind of desperate readiness for whatever truth awaited. "He made me promise to find you," Duncan said gently, kneeling beside her. "Made me swear on my Bible that I would put this in your hands no matter how far I had to ride. So here I am, 3 days and 100 miles from Willow Creek, keeping that promise." Grace took the envelope with shaking hands. "Did he suffer at the end?" "No more than any man dying of consumption suffers. But the chaplain said he went peacefully, said his last words were, 'Your name.'" Duncan paused. "Would you like me to read it? Your hands are shaking something fierce." "Yes, please, I don't think I can." She clutched Hope tighter, as if the baby could anchor her through whatever was coming. Duncan broke the seal and unfolded several sheets of paper covered in neat, careful handwriting. He cleared his throat and began to read. "My dearest Grace, if you are reading this, I am gone. Father Thomas tells me you were coming pregnant with our child. I wept at the news, not from sorrow, but joy. You carried our love even when I could not be there." Grace made a sound halfway between a sob and a laugh. "He knew. He died knowing about Hope." Duncan continued, "I know you ran, Grace. Hastings told me, and I forgave you the moment I heard. You were afraid. Fear is human. I was afraid too, afraid they would take you in prison. You hurt our child. I took the blame not from nobility, but from love. It was the only power I had to keep you safe. If I had to make the choice again, I would make it gladly." "But he shouldn't have had to," Grace whispered. "He shouldn't have had to choose. Captain Bernard Ashford is still out there. He knows I confessed. He may come for you to silence the only other witness to his theft. The receipts you signed, Grace. You didn't know, but they're evidence. If you read this, go to the U.S. Marshal in Helena. Show him the letter I've enclosed. My full confession with details only the real thief would know. They will protect you." Duncan paused, pulling out a second smaller envelope from the first. It was addressed to the U.S. Marshal's office, official and damning. "There's more," Duncan said quietly and continued reading. "Name our child something that means hope. Raise her or him to know that love is sacrifice, that grace is unearned, and that redemption is always possible, even for cowards like me who died in chains." "You weren't a coward," Grace said fiercely to the empty air, to the ghost of the man who would never hear her. "You were braver than anyone I've ever known." Duncan's voice grew thick with emotion as he read the final lines. "I love you. I forgave you. Now forgive yourself. Do not waste the freedom I bought with my silence. Live grace. Live fully. Love again if you can. And when our child asks about me, tell them their father's greatest act was not dying in prison, but choosing to let the woman he loved be free, your husband, James." The letter fell silent, but its words echoed in the stone chamber like a benediction. Grace bent over Hope, her tears falling onto the baby's sleeping face, and wept with a grief so profound that it seemed to fill the very walls of the mine. Elias stood in the entrance, watching his own face wet. He thought of Abigail's diary, of the words he had read too late to matter, of the forgiveness he had refused to give when it could have meant everything. James Cunningham had died in chains, but he had died free of bitterness, free of blame, free of the poison that had consumed Elias for 15 years. Hastings, standing guard over the prisoners, removed his hat and bowed his head. Even Ashford's hired men looked uncomfortable, as if witnessing something too sacred for their cynical eyes. Duncan folded the letter carefully and placed it in Grace's lap. Then he did something Elias had not expected. He lifted baby Hope from Grace's arms and held her up, as if presenting her to heaven itself. "In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti," he intoned. "This child born in darkness and pain, born of love and sacrifice, I baptize in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. What name do you give her, Grace?" Grace looked up, tears still streaming. "Hope. Hope Abigail Cunningham." She glanced at Elias. "Hope for what James wanted. Abigail for the woman who taught someone I love that forgiveness is possible." Elias felt something break open in his chest, something that had been sealed for so long he had forgotten it could open at all. Duncan smiled and touched the baby's forehead with water from his canteen. "Hope Abigail Cunningham, I baptize you in the name of all that is holy and true. May you grow in grace and strength, knowing you were loved before you were born and blessed before you drew breath." Hope woke at the touch of cold water and let out an indignant wail. The sound broke the solemn moment, and despite everything, despite the grief and exhaustion and fear, Grace laughed. "She has opinions," she said, taking her daughter back. "Strong ones, apparently." "Like her mother," Elias observed, moving into the mine, "and probably like her father, too." Outside, Ashford finally found his voice. "This is very touching, but it changes nothing. A dying man's letter is not legal evidence. Without corroboration, my word against his." Duncan emerged from the mine, and his face had transformed from gentle priest to something altogether more dangerous. "You think so? Then perhaps you'd like to explain to the U.S. Marshal why you hired 2 men to track down a pregnant woman in the wilderness, why you've been following her trail for weeks, why, if you're innocent, you're so desperate to silence her." "I'm protecting my reputation from slander." "No, you're protecting your neck from a noose." Duncan pulled out yet another document from his seemingly bottomless saddlebag. "This is a warrant for your arrest, signed by Judge Patterson in Colorado Springs and countersigned by the U.S. Marshal in Helena." James Cunningham's confession was detailed enough to verify against Army records. Payroll discrepancies that match your gambling debts, requisition forms in your handwriting, testimony from the quartermaster who saw you with the money 2 days before it was reported stolen. Ashford's face had gone gray. "That's impossible. There was no evidence." "There was plenty of evidence." It was just easier to blame a lieutenant than investigate a captain, but James Cunningham spent his dying months making sure the truth would come out. He wrote to every person who might have seen something, might remember something. He built a case against you from a prison cell because he knew even if he didn't live to see it, his wife would need protection. You're lying. I'm a priest's son. Lying's not in my repertoire. Duncan handed the warrant to Hastings. Sergeant, as an officer of Deer Lodge Prison, you're authorized to take this man into custody pending transfer to federal authorities. Hastings took the warrant with something like satisfaction on his weathered face. Captain Bernard Ashford, you're under arrest for theft of government property, fraud, and conspiracy. You'll be held at Deer Lodge pending trial. This is outrageous. I have rights. I demand— You demand nothing. Hastings cut him off. You're a thief and a coward who let a good man die in your place. Now you'll answer for it. The confrontation that followed was anticlimactic. Ashford, faced with legal documentation, and 3 armed men surrendered without violence. His hired guns, learning they had been working for a wanted criminal, quickly distanced themselves and rode off into the gathering darkness. By the time they had Ashford secured and the situation resolved, full night had fallen. They made camp in the mine building, up the fire, settling in for what remained of the dark hours. Duncan produced food from his saddlebags, the kind of plain fare that sustained travelers, and they ate in exhausted silence. Grace nursed hope and stared into the fire, her face a study in complicated grief. Elias sat beside her, not touching, just present, and finally she spoke. I should feel something, she said quietly. Relief that Ashford's caught, joy that James is vindicated. But all I feel is empty. He's gone, Elias. He died thinking I was coming to him, and I never made it. I failed him one last time. You didn't fail him, Duncan said from across the fire. Grace, I was there when he died. I held his hand at the end, and you want to know what he said, his very last words before he went to God. Grace nodded, unable to speak. He said, Tell Grace she's free. Tell her I kept my promise. He didn't die thinking you failed him. He died knowing he'd succeeded. In saving you, in protecting his child, in making sure the truth would survive him. Duncan's eyes were bright in the firelight. That man loved you more than his own life. Don't dishonor that love by carrying guilt he specifically asked you to put down. How do I do that? How do I just let it go? You don't? Not all at once. Not easily. Duncan glanced at Elias. But maybe you start by accepting that grace isn't something we earn. It's something we receive, especially when we don't deserve it. They reached Deer Lodge Prison 2 days later, not to see James alive, but to claim his body and what few possessions he had left behind. Grace insisted on going despite her recent childbirth, despite the cold, despite everything. She needed, she said, to see where he had lived and died, to say goodbye properly. The warden met them personally, a gruff man named Thompson, who nevertheless treated Grace with unexpected gentleness. Your husband was well liked here, Mrs. Cunningham. He made this place better. We're sorry for your loss. James's possessions filled a single small box. A few books, letters Grace had written early in his imprisonment, the photograph she had mentioned of her father and Elias, and a carefully wrapped bundle that proved to be baby clothes hand-sewn from scraps of fabric James had traded for or begged from the prison chaplain. He was making these for months, Thompson said. Didn't know if it was a boy or girl, so he made both. Said he wanted his child to have something from their father's hands. Grace held the tiny garments and wept, and Elias thought his heart might actually break from watching her. The U.S. Marshal arrived from Helena that afternoon, took custody of Ashford, and recorded Grace's statement about the receipts she had signed. You were deceived, Mrs. Cunningham, the Marshal assured her. There will be no charges against you. In fact, the Army owes you restitution. Widow's pension back pay. Your husband was denied compensation for wrongful suffering. I'd estimate around $2,000 total. Grace looked stunned. $2,000. It's not enough, not for what was taken from you, but it's what the law allows. The Marshal handed her an official document. This will take a few months to process, but the money will be sent to wherever you direct." After the marshal left, after Ashford was led away in chains to the same cells where James had died, after all the official business was concluded, Elias found Grace sitting alone in the prison cemetery. James's grave was fresh, the earth still dark, marked by a simple wooden cross the other prisoners had carved. She wasn't crying anymore, just sitting in the snow, hope bundled against her chest, staring at the grave, as if she could will the man beneath the earth to rise and meet his daughter. $2,000, she said when Elias sat down beside her. "I could go anywhere. Back east to family who disowned me, California, Denver. Start over somewhere nobody knows the story." "You could," Elias agreed. "Or I could stay, in Montana, where my husband died, but where my daughter was born." She looked at him. "Where there's a man who delivered her in a mine shaft and hasn't left my side since. Where there might be something like home if I'm brave enough to choose it." Elias felt his breath catch. "Grace, you don't owe me anything. You're free now, vindicated. You have money options, a whole life ahead of you." "I don't want options. I want certainty. And the only thing I'm certain of is that when I think about where I want Hope to grow up, I see mountains, and a cabin, and a man who taught me that broken people can still build something worth keeping. I'm not asking you to stay out of obligation or gratitude." "Good, because I'm not offering to stay for those reasons." Grace shifted Hope in her arms. "I'm offering because in 2 months of living in your cabin I was happier than I'd been in years, because you gave me shelter when I had nowhere to go, because you rode into a storm and helped me birth my daughter and didn't flinch when armed men came for me. Because you're a good man, Elias Mercer, even if you don't believe it." "I'm broken," he said roughly. "Damaged. I couldn't save my own wife and child. Neither could I save my husband, so we're even." She reached out and took his hand. "I'm not asking for romance or promises of love. I'm asking for partnership. You help me raise Hope, teach her about mountains and survival and how to be strong. I'll help you remember that life isn't just survival, that there's joy in small things, that forgiveness is possible. And if it doesn't work, if we can't make it, then at least we tried. Together." She squeezed his hand. "I'm tired of running, Elias. I want to stay. I want to build something. And I think if you're honest, you want that too." He looked at her, this woman who had come to his door with his rifle, and her secrets, who had transformed his cabin from a tomb of memory into something that felt almost like home. He thought about Hope, about the baby he had delivered and blessed with his dead wife's name, about the future he had thought was closed to him, opening up like spring after a long winter. "I'd want to do it properly," he said. "Marriage, legal and binding, so Hope has a father in name as well as practice, so you have security." "Are you proposing Elias Mercer?" "I suppose I am. Badly." Grace smiled, and it transformed her grief-worn face into something luminous. "Then I suppose I'm accepting, equally badly." They were married a week later, in the small church in Willow Creek, with Father Duncan performing the ceremony and half the town in attendance. Grace wore a simple dress the church ladies had sewn, and Elias wore his best clothes stiff with disuse. Hope, now 2 weeks old, slept through most of the service and woke only to voice her objection during the final blessing, which made everyone laugh and felt exactly right. Duncan pronounced them husband and wife, with a satisfaction that suggested he had known all along how this story would end. "What God has joined, let no man tear asunder," he intoned, "and Elias, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was chaste, careful, a promise of something that might grow into love, but was for now simply commitment and hope. When they parted, Hope was watching them with dark, serious eyes that seemed to understand more than any baby should. "Welcome to the family, little one," Elias whispered to her, and for the first time in 15 years, he meant it when he smiled. Spring came early that year, as if nature itself had decided they had suffered enough winter. By late March, snow was melting off the lower slopes, revealing the first brave shoots of wildflowers. Elias had spent the winter months expanding the cabin, adding a proper bedroom for him and Grace, a nursery for Hope, a root cellar that would keep food fresh well into next winter. Grace worked beside him when she could, and when she couldn't, she filled the cabin with small touches that made it feel lived in rather than simply inhabited. Curtains on the windows, flowers on the table, the smell of bread baking and coffee brewing, the sound of a baby crying and being comforted. One morning in April, Elias woke to find Grace already up standing at the window, with Hope in her arms, looking out at the mountains painted gold by the rising sun. "What are you thinking?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "That I'm writing James a letter, even though he'll never read it." She looked up at him. "I want to tell him about Hope, about how she has his dark eyes and stubborn chin, about the man who's raising her, who teaches her about mountains and animals and the kind of quiet strength James would have respected." "You think he'd approve of this, of us?" "I think he'd be grateful that his daughter has a father who chose her, that I have a partner who sees me, really sees me, broken parts and all, and stays anyway." She leaned against Elias, easy and comfortable in a way that still surprised him. "I think he'd tell me I'm living the freedom he died to give me, and that's what matters." Elias wrapped his arms around them both. Grace and Hope, this family he had not sought, but somehow been blessed with anyway. Outside the mountains stood eternal witness to all the lives that had struggled and failed, and sometimes, if they were very lucky, found grace in the most unexpected places. "We should go to the ridge today," he said. "Plant flowers on the graves, all three of them, Abigail and Thomas and James. They're part of our story too." "I'd like that." They made the climb that afternoon, Hope bundled in a carrier on Grace's back. Elias carrying wildflower starts they had nursed through the late winter. At the ridge, 3 graves stood in a neat row, the wooden markers weathered but still legible. Grace knelt by James's grave, the one they had arranged to move from Deer Lodge to this high place where the wind sang through the pines. She placed flowers and spoke quietly words meant only for the dead in the mountain. Elias stood by Abigail's grave and Thomas's, and for the first time in 15 years he spoke to them without guilt. "I brought you a family," he said quietly. "Grace and Hope. I think you'd like them. I think maybe you sent them to me in some way I'll never understand. Thank you for that, for this second chance I never thought I'd get." When they walked back down the mountain as the sun set, Hope asleep and content. Grace's hand in his, Elias felt something he had not felt since before the war, since before the grief and guilt and self-imposed exile. Peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of acceptance. The past would always be there, carved into the ridge like those graves, permanent and unchangeable. But the future was still being written one day at a time, one choice at a time, one small act of grace building on another, until something like redemption emerged from the ruins of what had been lost. That night, after Hope was asleep and the fire-banked Elias and Grace sat on the porch and watched stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. The air smelled of pine and earth and the promise of summer. "Do you think we'll be happy?" Grace asked. "I think we already are," Elias replied. "We just didn't notice because we were too busy expecting something different." She laughed, the sound carrying across the valley like music. "I suppose you're right. Happiness isn't what I thought it would be. It's quieter, simpler, more like contentment than joy. Nothing wrong with contentment, it lasts longer. Spoken like a true mountain man." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that came from two people who had learned they did not need to fill every moment with words. Inside, Hope stirred and made a small sound, then settled back into sleep. Outside, the world turned slowly toward summer, toward warmth, toward all the ordinary miracles that made up a life. Grace leaned her head on Elias's shoulder. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for giving me a place to land when I was falling. Thank you for teaching me it's not too late. For grace, for new beginnings, for choosing to stay when you could have gone anywhere. There's nowhere else I'd rather be, And in that moment, on a porch in the Bitterroot Mountains, with a baby sleeping inside, and the ghosts of the past finally at rest on the ridge, above two broken people who had found each other in the darkest winter, discovered what they had been searching for all along. Not perfection, not the erasure of pain, not even the kind of passionate love that songs celebrated and stories promised, but something better, something that would last. Home.